A woman met her future husband in college. They met sophomore year and they immediately hit it off and started a relationship. And this was fortunately a relationship that would last them the rest of their lives because they were eventually married after college. During college, after they had been together for about a year and a half, they had a very scary incident happen to them. The husband, or I guess the then boyfriend, was driving alone in his truck at night. It was winter time, and as he was driving, he went over a patch of black ice. And he immediately lost control of his vehicle, and it started skidding across the road. It skidded all the way into oncoming traffic, and it slammed head on with a truck that was coming the opposite direction. Both of the trucks were completely totaled. Not only totaled, but they were just a complete mangled wreck. EMS and fire and the police all arrived very quickly because it looked like this was going to be a terrible wreck. And as EMS was approaching the scene, their immediate thought was, people have died in this wreck because this looks terrible. And as EMS approached the wreck, they saw two men that were standing kind of on the outskirts of the wreck. They went very quickly up to these two men and they said to them, is anyone trapped in the wreckage? Have you seen anybody? And the men said to the EMS person, no, we're the drivers. We're right here. There are no other passengers. It's just us. And the EMS looked at both men and just shook his head like, that can't be right. I'm looking at this accident. I have seen fatal car accidents before. Somebody either died or got seriously, seriously injured in this. But they were insistent. They said, no, it was only us. I hit a patch of black ice. I skidded across the road. I went headfirst into his truck, but somehow we're okay. EMS evaluated both of them, and neither of them had a scratch on them. Somehow, both of these men were completely unharmed. Even when they sent the images of the wreck to the insurance company, the insurance agent couldn't believe what he was seeing. He could not believe that somebody went through this kind of accident and not only survived, but didn't have any serious life-threatening injuries. But the young couple was just very grateful that somehow he came through this without any injuries and that he didn't seriously injure anybody else. It seemed like a miracle. So the boyfriend was physically fine, but he had seen his life flash before his eyes. He believed in that instant as he was going into oncoming traffic, he believed that he was about to die, and so he was very rattled for quite some time after the accident. A few weeks after the accident, he went over to his girlfriend's apartment like he did very, very frequently, and he walked into her bedroom and made a comment about the television. He pointed at the television and he said, "Oh, when did you get a flat screen TV?" And she looked at him and said, I've always had that TV. I've had that TV since I was in high school. As long as you've known me, I've had that TV. And something about that just resonated with him. And he got very, very serious and he said, "No, you didn't. This is a new TV. No, what happened to the big tube TV that you used to have? You used to have this big tube TV that I used to make jokes about it because it was so big that it barely fit on your dresser." But she insisted. She said, "No, I promise you, as long as you've known me, I've had this TV." And he started to get very upset and very insistent. And so she said, "Hang on a second." And she went on her Facebook and she started pulling up old pictures. And she found a picture of them from back when they had first started dating, and they were in her room, and the dresser was in the background. And sure enough, on the dresser was the same flat screen TV. And she looked at him, and he was absolutely rattled by this. He was so shaken by the fact that this TV was not the way he had remembered it, that he started to tear up and he started to get choked up, and he was just saying, "I don't understand it. I know for a fact that you had a big tube TV here. I don't understand." She thought it was a little strange, but she just tried to comfort him. After all, he had just gone through a very scary, very traumatic experience, and she just kind of figured it was some result from that he was under so much stress because of what happened, that this one little thing that he misremembered was kind of setting him off. That was pretty much the end of the TV incident, and as time went on, he was even able to kind of laugh about it, even though he still, for years, had very clear memories of that tube TV that used to be on the dresser, or so he remembers. Fast forward 7 years, the couple is now out of college, and they're married, and they're thinking about starting a family soon, and they're on a very nice vacation in Italy, and they're in Rome, and they're just kind of walking around and taking in the sights and eating good food. And very suddenly, the wife starts to feel very ill. At first, it starts as a stomach ache, and she's thinking, oh, great, I've got food poisoning, which she'd had food poisoning before, so she knew it was nothing to be trifled with. So she mentioned to her husband that she wasn't feeling well, but that she could power through it. She had had food poisoning before, and as long as it didn't get any worse than this, she would at least be able to walk around and continue sightseeing. But as time went on, over the next few minutes, she started feeling worse and worse and worse. What had started as a simple stomach ache now felt like she had been hit in the gut with a baseball bat. And her head was pounding, and she started to feel very weak, and her vision started to go blurry. And her husband looked over at her and said, "Oh my God, are you okay?" Because he noticed that all of the blood had drained from her face. She was somebody who, prided herself on a very high pain tolerance. And so even still, she was trying to say, no, 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 I'm okay. But as she was speaking, she collapsed to the ground. They immediately called an ambulance. And fortunately, there was one very close by. And they put her in the ambulance and they rushed her over to the nearest hospital. Now, she doesn't remember all of the details at this point in the story because she was so out of it. But all she remembers hearing was the doctor saying, "We need to get you into emergency surgery right now, right this second. We need to put you into surgery." The next thing that she knew, she was waking up in a bed in the hospital. The doctor came in and explained to her that she had had an ectopic pregnancy. And it had ruptured, and she was bleeding to death. And if they had gotten to the hospital even 30 minutes later, she almost certainly would have died. And so she can't believe it. She can't believe what just happened. She can't believe how close to death she just came, and how stressful that is to go through that in another country. But she's slowly able to recover, at least physically recover, and go home. And over the next month or so, recovered at home. And it was easier for her to physically recover than it was for her to psychologically recover. This was something that really, really scared her. She had never come even remotely that close to death before. And to be told that she was only half an hour away from certain death was something that really scared her. But time went on, and slowly she was feeling better. She was feeling physically better, psychologically better, and was certainly improving. About 2 months later, the couple is in their kitchen together, and they're cooking a meal together and just sort of talking about random topics, and the topic of kitchen fires just kind of randomly comes up. They're talking about how dangerous kitchen fires are, and how you're not supposed to deep fry a turkey that's still frozen, and all these kinds of things. And she makes a comment to her husband. She says, "Oh, well, don't worry about it because we have that fire extinguisher in the closet." And he looks at her and says, "We don't have a fire extinguisher in the closet." And she says, "Oh, yeah, we definitely do. You don't remember? As soon as we bought this house, we realized that there wasn't a fire extinguisher. So we went right out to the home improvement store and we bought a fire extinguisher. And we bought one of those little frames where you can screw it into a wall and you can put it up on the wall. And we did that in the closet. You don't remember that?" And he looks confused and just says, "Nope, that never happened. We never did that." But she's positive that it happened. So she grabs him, by the wrist and starts leading him into the next room where they had this little closet where they would essentially put coats. And that's where the extinguisher was supposed to be. And she opens it up, but there's no extinguisher. And she's looking at where it's supposed to be, and it's just like her mind is not processing what she's seen. She knows that it's supposed to be there. She has a clear, vivid memory of them going to the store, of buying the items and of setting it up in the closet right there. And she's staring closely this far away from the wall because she's trying to see if there's any marks where it was screwed in. She's trying to see if any of the paint was disturbed, but she doesn't see anything. And she starts to get extremely emotional and upset about it. And she realizes that what she is feeling right now in this moment is the exact same feeling that her husband felt 7 years prior after he had gotten into his accident and found out about the TV. She felt like she just could not wrap her head around the fact that that fire extinguisher was not there. She acknowledges that these might seem like insignificant details, but she points out that in both instances, this same thing occurred within a couple months of each of them having a near-death experience. And so she wonders, is this a result of trauma, of coming so close to death that your brain just kind of rewires? Or is there something else, some kind of glitch at play here? A young man grew up in India with a big, extensive family that was all very, very close. Before the young man went off to university, he had a sit-down discussion with his father, who just kind of wanted to relay some life advice to his son and tell him about his university experience. So his dad starts telling him some stuff that he already knows. His father tells him that he grew up in complete poverty, extremely poor, had nothing but his family to help him. He grew up in one of the worst neighborhoods in their city and saw really bad crime and violence growing up. And all of that the son knew, but then his father started to tell him some things that he didn't know or didn't know the whole story. So right before his father had started university, when he was a young man, his father, the young man's grandfather, had passed away. And the grandfather was sort of the bedrock of the family for them. He was always there whenever anybody needed anything. He would drive no matter what the distance was. He would drive and he would help you even if you just need to, install a new window in your house. He would drive 5 hours just to help you with that. He was that kind of guy. And so when the grandfather passed away, there was this massive void in the family. And the young man's father knew that it was now going to fall on him. He was the firstborn son of his father, and it was now his responsibility to care for the family. But the father quickly got overwhelmed. He was trying to work as many hours as humanly possible to help support his family, all the while going to university. And to make matters even worse, when he had signed up for his classes at the university, he had sat down with an advisor who kind of told him, which major to take and which classes to take. But pretty soon after he started taking those classes, he realized that it was really bad advice, because he shows up for class on the first day and he realizes that all of the classes were being taught in English. And at that time, he barely spoke any English. And in this particular university at the time, you couldn't just withdraw from those classes and get your money back. You had already paid the money, you had to take the class. And so he felt like he was stuck. So he just decided, I'm just going to do my absolute best. I'm going to work for my family. I'm going to support my family. I am going to do the best I can in these classes. I'm going to learn English. And he just worked and worked and worked and worked. And later on in life would even earn a master's degree in English literature. But at this time in his life, he was just completely overwhelmed. And so he was having trouble keeping up in his classes, and his grades were starting to slip. And he was trying his best to keep up at work to continue to earn money, but he was having trouble at work too. And he told his son, at this time, I just felt like an absolute idiot. And I felt worthless. And I felt like I couldn't do any of these things. I couldn't succeed in school. I couldn't provide for my family. I couldn't take care of my family. And he tells him that this was easily, without a doubt, the lowest point of his life. and all he wanted to do was just run away and run away from all of his problems, but he knew that he couldn't, and so he just felt hopeless. So the father had really poured his heart out to this young man, to his son, and he just wanted to make sure that his son, before going off to university, understood sometimes you just have to work hard to get through things. And so the day after they had this really emotional conversation, his father had to drive out of town for 3 hours to go help some relatives in another city. And he's kind of running into traffic. It's taking him much longer than he expected to get to this other city. So when he's about halfway, he pulls over to a rest stop and he decides to give his son a call and just tell him, "Hey, I'm still driving. It's probably going to take me a little bit longer than I expected." So he calls his son to let him know about the delay, and kind of out of nowhere, the young man gets very emotional. And he's thinking about the conversation that they had had the previous day, and he's thinking about all of the things that his father had to sacrifice for his family and all of the things that he had to do. And he says to his dad before they hang up the phone, "You do so much for everyone, and you work so hard, and I'm so proud of you." And he can tell on the other end that his father's starting to get choked up and is trying to cut the call short. And before he hangs up, he says to his son, "Thank you so much for telling me that, son. When we get back, I have something important to tell you, but we'll talk about it when I get home." And he quickly hangs up the phone. And the young man is assuming that the father just hung up the phone quickly because he didn't want his son to hear him crying on the other end of the phone, because he was from a different time where it was not very acceptable for men to be crying like that. So the father returns the next day and comes back in, and he hugs his son and he says, can we talk about that thing real quick? And of course his son says, "Sure." And they go into another room and they sit down. And the father says to his son, "There's one more thing that I didn't tell you about that dark time in my life." And the son says, "Okay, well, you can tell me now. You can tell me anything." And the father says, "On one occasion during that period when I was going to university and I just felt like my entire world was falling apart, I was asked by another relative to drive out of town and go help them, similar to what I just did. In that instance, I took a bus, and about halfway we stopped at a bus depot. And while I was there, I decided to call my mother, call your grandmother, and just tell her where I was and what time I would probably be over to our relative's house." So I walked over to the payphone, and I pick up the phone and I put it up to my ear, and I'm about to dial, but before I even dial the phone, I hear a voice. And the voice says, "You do so much for everyone. You work so hard, and I'm so proud of you." For years and years, I didn't know whose voice that was. I didn't know if I imagined it. I didn't know if it was some sign from the great beyond. But yesterday, when you talked to me on the phone, I finally realized that voice was yours. 30 years ago, before you were even born, I heard your voice on the phone say, "You do so much for everyone. You work so hard, and I'm so proud of you." That voice that I heard 30 years ago is what got me through that dark time in my life, because I was ready to roll over and give up. I felt like I had nothing left to give. And when I heard that voice on the phone, it just made me feel like I can push through. I have the strength to continue on. And because of that, I finished university. I got a master's degree in English literature. I have an amazing job. I have an amazing family. I have so many things. And if I had given up on what I was doing, I never would have gotten any of that. They're obviously both very emotional and they hug each other, but neither of them has any idea how that could be. But the father swears that the voice that he heard on the phone 30 years prior was the voice of his sons before he was even born. This story takes place about 40 years ago in the 1980s. A flight attendant named Rob was working flights all over the country, but he worked a lot of transcontinental flights, flights that would essentially go from the West Coast to the East Coast and the East Coast to the West Coast. Again, this is the 1980s, so this is air travel prior to 9/11, which is a whole different world than what it is now. If you got in a time machine and you went back to the 1980s and you went to an airport, you would be shocked at how different it was. There was far less security, there were far fewer checks. It was pretty much the Wild West compared to today. And so on this particular day, Rob is working a red-eye flight going from San Francisco to New York City. Red-eye flights are generally overnight flights, so flights that happen late at night. Rob liked working red-eye flights because there were usually fewer passengers, and the passengers that were on the plane usually slept most of the time. So just like today, when the passengers are boarding, the flight attendants and the crew will kind of stand near the front of the plane to greet them as they come onto the plane, to help anybody that needs help putting their luggage in the compartments and that sort of thing. So Rob is standing there and he's greeting the passengers that are coming aboard, and it's getting close to the time where they're going to close the door and get ready to taxi on the runway. And a man walks onto the flight that really stands out to Rob. He was about 40 years old. He was wearing a very high quality tailored suit, and he was carrying with him a big metal briefcase. And something about him just really stood out. It might have been the fact that most people don't dress up like that for a red-eye flight. This guy was wearing a very expensive suit on a late-night flight. It might have been how odd the metal suitcase was, but whatever it was, this individual really stood out to Rob. And he watched this individual walk down the plane and get a seat in the back of the plane close to where the bathrooms are. So the time comes to close the door of the plane, and prior to taking off, the flight attendants would make a count of the passengers. So Rob and another attendant, they both make a count to make sure that their counts match, and they do. They have 35 passengers on board the flight. So they take off and they start heading for New York City, and it's a very smooth, very easy flight. Most of the passengers sleep the whole way, and it's a pretty easy night for Rob. When they land in New York City, Rob goes around to make a final count of the passengers. They were supposed to have a pre-flight count as well as a post-flight count to make sure that those numbers match, obviously. And so Rob starts going up the aisles and he's counting passengers, and he remembers that when they took off they had 35, but now he's only counting 34. So he makes the count again, 34. He has another flight attendant make the count, again, 34. So he's saying, we're missing somebody here. We need to search this plane until we find this person. They search in the bathroom, they search in the overhead compartments, they search every nook and cranny of the plane, but no matter what they do, they're only able to count 34 passengers. So Rob is standing there and he's trying to think, is there anybody I remember seeing get on this plane that I'm not seeing now? And that's when he remembers the interesting man with the tailored suit and the metal briefcase. He says, I know that guy was sitting in the back close to the bathrooms, but he's not there now. Where did this guy go? They continue to look, and still, they're not finding this man. So eventually, they have to bring security on board the plane, and security does an even more thorough search, searching every nook and cranny of the plane, and they have to find this guy before they can deboard the passengers. But no matter where they look, they're not able to find this man. Eventually, they have no choice, and they just have to let the passengers go, and they have to file an official report that says, we had 35 people when we took off. We now have 34. I know who it is that's not here. I can give you a physical description of him, but you also have to remember, in the 1980s, it wasn't like today where they scan your ticket as you're getting on the plane. They didn't have that kind of technology yet. So they made a report on it, but as far as Rob knows, nothing ever came from it. He has no idea who this man was, and he has no idea what happened to him. If you like stories told to you by an awkward man in his 30s, why not subscribe? Why not like the video? And why not stick around for the next one? Because it's gonna be good.